virtual salon for our no due date subscription book club. This month, talking about, I confess, one of the strangest books I've ever read, The Master and Margarita. We have Pete here, of course, and I'm super happy today to welcome my buddy Juliette Sellgren, who is a student, but is also notably the creator and host of the Great Antidote podcast, which is hosted on our Adam Smith Works site. She's got a couple of interviews, or she's done a couple of interviews with Pete, as well as lots of other folks we've seen here in our no due date salons, like Russ Roberts, like Sarah Squire, like Chris Coyne and Pete Leeson. So I will put a link in there for you to check all those things out. I hope you do. Juliette also has a very keen interest in Russian literature, which confounds me a little bit. So hopefully we can explore that over the next hour or so. So with that said, as always, if there are, we will collect all the links and Shelley will put those into the portal for us after. But otherwise, it's your conversation. Welcome. It's good to see everyone. Take it away, Pete.
Hey, great. I'm also very thrilled to be here with Juliette. I think that she is actually a wizard, and so I'm thrilled to have this conversation with her. And my first question, Juliette, is actually very basic, which how does a student in economics decide to study Russian literature?
Well, this is a good question. I can't stop smiling. I'm excited to be here. I don't want to say nervous, but I'm not nervous. I think it's because honestly, we have to, in order to do economics properly, and not many people do economics properly. Maybe a hot take, maybe not. We have to actually engage with philosophical questions and human nature. And honestly, I see Russian lit as, this book is maybe an exception, but more explicitly asking the same questions, but using different methods to answer them. I think Russian lit is funny because as much as we know that, I really like the 19th century of Russian lit, and as much as we know what happens in the 20th, they have a really good sense of economics. They actually understand trade-offs and the philosophical, more Austrian, less empirical version of economics that I think is fundamental to getting at what human nature means. They understand trade-offs and institutions and incentives. And that sounds really not boring, but like not like a fiction you would want to read necessarily, because that's not necessarily why we read fiction, but it uses the same methods through like society tales, which I think it's fun. It's a different way to explore the things that even using something as explicit as economics. Well, I guess economics is both explicit and implicit, and that's the point. So I'm getting a little confused with myself here, but I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of not really an answer, but I think it's very similar in economics in a way that we don't necessarily think often when we think about literature.
Yeah, no, actually, that's a very good answer. It's not a non-answer. Let me assure you. So by 19th century, I think, if I understand correctly, that means you're talking about Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and whatnot.
The big guys.
Yeah, and Amy will hate me for bringing this up, but Chris Ciabera, in his book on Ayn Rand, the Russian radical, tries to place Rand's literature in that same intellectual tradition of the great Russian novelist, and tries to go through that. But and that's something maybe we can explore in the Q&A or something like that. That might be a touchstone for some people, or maybe not. Maybe it's a turnoff. But Tolstoy and Dostoevsky wrote, amazing works, and you're exactly right. They're explorations into the human condition. Do you have a favorite among those that you would really recommend people to tackle? I mean, War and Peace is quite long, and but I mean, but also, there's all kinds of things with Dostoevsky that also you can draw on there, and so Who would you recommend?
I think it kind of depends on what you like. So, the big three, you have Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Turgenev, who is the lesser known one, who kind of fell out of favor in terms of getting translated into English in the last like 100 years or so. But was actually the most well known in the time that they were writing of the three of them worldwide. So he's my favorite. Um, they write about different things. So if you enjoy um, the kind of like psychoanalysis, like deep, like kind of like visceral emotions, what is up with like justice and mankind and good and evil, and they all talk about good and evil, as is kind of clear from this work, but that's Dostoevsky. So Crime and Punishment. He's fascinated with the courts and what happens to man after a man commits something, commits a crime, something bad. Not just what happens in the justice system world, but what actually happens to man himself. Because the theory is it's not good for man to commit evil. So Crime and Punishment, my favorite Dostoevsky by far. It's very he's very zoomed in. So a lot of his books, like Brothers, is one of his longest works, and it takes place over the course of 3 days. Whereas War and Peace, Tolstoy's largest work, takes place over the course of like several decades. So they're very different in terms of like how they go about this. Tolstoy is my favorite is Anna Karenina. He's kind of like a dualist, which I really enjoy. So he like in this one, there are two plots that were two different stories that he actually ended up making one, which I think is enjoyable because they end up being two sides of the same coin in terms of the story he tells. His characters go through very different life events and realizations, but you kind of see throughout the story that he's juxtaposing them against each other, which I like. It feels like a trade-off. Maybe that's why I like it. So that one's great. 10 out of 10 recommend. He focuses a lot more on I think familial dynamics. It's less what's going on inside your mind, and it's more perception. How are you perceived by others versus how you feel internally? And he's very focused on not the mental, but the physical. This is like a big important thing in Russia because there's this idea of the Russian like look and the way the Russian woman moves and the Russian man, like they are very like stereotypical looking characters. So that's kind of his thing, playing around with that and how physicality kind of changes virtue, or how virtue, like the relationship between those two, which is fascinating. I also really like him. And then Turgenev, he focuses a lot on like intergenerational conflict and the relationship between virtue and the internal and the external and society, and kind of the mix between the institutions and the ideologies and the temperaments between people and how that can like make us better or worse. So Fathers and Children, I recommend the second Norton translation, or it's also translated as Fathers and Sons, one of my favorite works of Russian literature of all time. So that was like a very long answer when I could have just said one, but I will say three. So it kind of depends on who you are, and that's the other thing I love because it embodies really well a school of thought really that has so much variety within, but that also has common themes. They're all getting at the same questions and they're writing in the same time, so they're talking about the same stuff and they have the same reference points. So you learn the history once and you can read all these works and have access to so much.
I want to ask you a question I didn't, which is sort of a meta question, which is if you think about, the kind of literature that gets at the human condition, you have also, literature that's from, basically it's from Europe, as opposed to American literature, right? And so, even British literature, you can give Dickens or whatever, right? But you got Kafka, writing in Prague. You have, we read earlier, like Arthur Kessler talking about, the sort of show trials in the Soviet Union. You have, of course, Solzhenitsyn, which Russ did a whole deep dive in, about and these things. Why do you think that's the case that these countries, especially so go before the totalitarian experience, but nevertheless, it was still the case that they talked about the coming problem of totalitarianism. Like that's what's going on in Kafka. That's what's going on in Crime and Punishment, right? It relates to that. How did they have a window into that even before it sort of happens?
From what I can understand, the Slavic tradition and kind of like the Eastern European experience and identity has always embraced torture and suffering. So some of these authors, there will be friction when you're reading them from like an American standpoint, because they embrace suffering, not necessarily as good, but either as a way to God or a way of understanding what it means to be human. And in America, we're all about the pursuit of happiness, which we never promise comes without suffering, but we don't embrace it as part of our identity to talk about what it means to pursue it in the negative, right? So by experiencing suffering, you have a better idea of what it means to be happy. First line of Anna Karenina: every happy family is the same, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own unique way, or something. And I think that's what it is.
I think that's actually very perceptive of you. This is an indication of your wizardry. But because one of the things that struck me when I went to Moscow was this embrace of suffering, and they do view it like heroic, as opposed to. And I remember thinking at the time, this was many years ago, and it was before our current cultural conversation in the United States. But I remember thinking that the equivalent would be as if someone came to the United States for the first time, and the first trip you took them to was a slave plantation. And then you talked about everything, the human suffering and everything, and that was the identity of the people or whatever, as opposed to, and I remember thinking how depressing that would be, as opposed to telling maybe a mythology of the Horatio Alger kind of story, right? Immigrant comes here with a penny in their pocket and then ends up by amassing, millions or whatever, which is kind of the story here, as opposed to, and I'll tell you the story that in Russian is phenomenal, is St. Basil's Cathedral, right, in Moscow. So when Ivan the Terrible had the architect build this beautiful, cathedral, I don't know if you noticed, but the next act that he did was he had that architect's eyes poked out. Right? The eyes got poked out, so he could never build something as beautiful as this ever again anywhere. And when Russians tell you this story, they tell it with glee. Like, this is like, and it's like the weirdest thing. And there's also a story about the rebellion at the Kremlin, at the wall. And they have this giant bell, and its tongue is slashed out of it, the bell. So compare that to the Liberty Bell, right? So their bell is that, Ivan the Terrible had this rebellion. These revolutionaries tried to overturn him. So, and they signaled the revolution by, ringing the bell. And so he had the tongue slashed out of the bell. He like put the two brothers up and he tortured them in competing torture and everything like that. And again, Russians are telling you the story about how robust and proud these brothers are. And so it's a totally weird kind of like culture. And this is going to reveal like my non-wizardry thing. I've had the fortune, because as an economist, to travel quite around a lot of places. And like Buenos Aires is the most mysterious place to me, because, and I'm like, this should be just a city. Like, why the hell is it all messed up? Right. It sort of freaks me out. But when I went to Romania for the first time, again, I started walking around Romania and I go, I can understand completely why this place is so screwed up, because it's kind of like in the air of the place. It's just a weird mix of things. And I think this is, an issue of Slavic, issues, which are quite fascinating. All right. So I'm going to stop revealing my own ignorance here. But I want to ask you about this particular book and how you would place it in those great pieces of Russian literature, because this, this is required reading, by the way, for all Russian students in school now, right? So they're going to have to read, this book. So how would you place it in that literature?
Well, so this book posed a particular challenge for me. It comes after the period that I'm the most familiar with. And also it comes at a time where I'm very uncomfortable because I don't like totalitarianism. But also there was a lot of censorship, right? So a lot of the context for this work is that he actually wasn't really able to publish it. It didn't come out in full until 1973. And so kind of given that context, it not only is it kind of foreign because it's Russian, which I think I'm comfortable with, but only relatively. I live with two girls who are both half Russian, and they are way more comfortable than I am with it. But also, it comes from this regime and this time that I really don't love and can't really understand because I love and appreciate freedom. I think in a lot of ways, it maybe aligns more with the French existentialist phenomenological tradition where they're like talking about like all these absurd things. Like you think like The Stranger. Like, why is this guy who's kind of psychotic? Why did he kill those people? And why is he just feeling weird about the fact that his neighbor kicked his dog? And why is that the entire reflection of the book instead of the fact that it starts with his mother dying? And that's never a major plot point. But it feels like it should be. I think it fits more with that in a way. So if you kind of hold in your mind the weird responses to these regimes, and kind of this like, what does it mean to be a human in a time when the institutions around us actually don't embrace human nature, right? It's like absurd. It contrasts what I think we think of as an uplifting institution, and also this like strong heritage of what it means to be a Russian, what it means to be a Russian author. It's kind of weirdly in between those two things. And so there are some things I'm very comfortable with, right? So like, and now I'm trying to think of an example. It reads very strongly in a way. It's almost like bullish, but it's also like, it almost feels like it's like, you must understand what I'm talking about, which I guess is part of what its glory is, that it expects you to understand. Because in Russia, there's always been this understanding of like where they come from and what their culture is, and it's very clear in their writing. Like, this is Russian. It has a very distinct flavor. But then you're thrown in the midst of like, why is there no difference in the chaos caused by the Soviet state and the devil? Like, when people are disappearing, it doesn't matter who make them disappear. And that's very weird. And that's not in line with the tradition. And so I think it does a very good job, but in a way that is hard to wrap your head around initially, of showing you exactly what is wrong with the picture that it's presenting. But it asks you to take it seriously, which is, I think, how it's a little different from maybe the stuff that follows, because the existentialists kind of like revolt against the institution and totalitarianism and kind of pro-communism in the French sense, but this book is not pro-communism in any sense because it actually lived through what that meant, and it's not ideal, right? I don't know. I kind of lost my train of thought there, but it's very weird is what it is. I think it's hard to place it on purpose, which I think is good because it gutturally captures maybe what it felt like. Maybe.
Sorry about that. That's my dog. I have a question for you about your pets, but so that was a very good answer, and so I think I'm going to be able to skip, a little bit of the questions that I was asking you, because you already sort of got to the essential point, which is that what Bulgakov is a writer, and the writers are being censored. And he feels like his life is falling apart, and then he gets this reprieve from Stalin, basically. But yet at the same time, he's existing under this, totalitarian regime. And, he's writing this on the side. It's samizdat. It's hidden. It's not part of his body of work. And, that affects like all the things, like what he's trying to do. And also, call the hypocrisy out, which is associated with the whole issues. That's like what the Pontius Pilate story is all. So he has the book comes in 3 parts, right? And so it's like, basically Stalin shows up in Moscow. We call him the devil, and he starts having all these people disappear and blah blah blah. And then you have this whole sort of story about the long history of that. You can't know good unless you know evil, and all those things like that are going on. And then you have this absurdist, kind of crazy story about the pact that the writer or the author or the intellectual must engage in, and that's in some sense the story with the Master and the Margarita, right? Is that the Master is him and the Margarita is his wife, and they have this pact which they have to sort of wrestle through. Anyway, it's kind of a bizarro story on its own, but at the same time, it's touching on, just like you said before, something very deep about the human condition, right? And that goes throughout history rather than just a particular totalitarian period. But I love the way that you put this, which is, what does it mean to be human when all the institutions around you, in some sense, are inhuman, right? And so I think it's very, very good.
You put it better than I did.
Any take on city and magic and religion in his social commentary? Like, do you have any, like, why leverage those? Is that just part of our psychology?
I think part of it feels as though it's like protective, right? Because it feels like he's writing in a time of censorship. You get this sense it's almost Kierkegaardian. I say that as though I didn't just read Kierkegaard for the first time last month. Kierkegaard plays with you. He will give you something, and then he will retell the same thing multiple times. He is like a lyricist. He will not explicitly tell you what you're meant to receive from his writing. And I think this is because the ideas that he has are kind of contrary to those of the time, right? Kierkegaard was an individualist, but he was also like super religious. And talking about the melding of those two things is not very popular. And in the same way, I think making it hard to grasp the explicit message and the explicit comparison and kind of making it fantastical is kind of protective. It means he can't get in trouble, even though obviously publishing problems. So part of me thinks that it's like, even if you do pick it up, you're not guaranteed to understand what he's trying to say. So you already have to be kind of clued into, oh, well, either what do I think about the human condition and the institutions necessary for flourishing, or you have to have like kind of lived or know about the Soviet state. And I think it's the mixing of magic and religion is super interesting, because magic is kind of the fantastical element, but religion, at least in this time in Russia, was really frowned upon. Like, it was not, it was basically considered magic, which is funny because to me, when I read it, I take the two as interchangeable, even though today I think we have the freedom for them to be distinctly different things. And so it's kind of protective, but it's kind of a, I don't know. It's almost as though he's not writing it for the people of the present in the time period of the novel, because they take them to be synonymous, whereas I think he realized and meant for us to see that they're two distinctly different things.
Yeah.
Because like if you notice, I think Christ is mentioned like 3 times. Like they go, oh Christ, 3 times. Literally 3 times. Everyone else is cursing on the devil and being like, oh, the devil knows, the devil this, the devil that. And he's kind of making fun of them almost. Like you get what you ask for. So I don't know.
It's funny, you know, like religion is such a crucial part of understanding much of intellectual history because of the role that religion plays really until the 20th century as so vital of things. I'm reading a very, very strange book at the moment, but it's actually very textually justified. It's called The Devil and Karl Marx. And it's actually a very good piece of scholarship that's very detailed, dedicated, deep dive into Marx's writings before even the economic and philosophical manuscripts. He tried to be a poet, he tried to be a playwright, you know, what he was doing with all those things like that. And it's and religion is such an essential part. You know, so yes, Marx is known as, you know, this sort of someone who tried to, you know, put an end to God, right? But at the same time, if you have a passion to put an end to God, you're actually obsessed with God, right? In a weird way. And so this is it's a very interesting book, and I think a lot of intellectual history misses the point when it doesn't wrestle. Going back to your point about dealing with the human condition, this is, you know, one of our major things. Okay, last question, and then we'll get everyone involved. Is the following, which is, you have beautiful cats, all right, and in fact they're gorgeous cats. Did you find Behemoth to be an offensive portrayal, or were you intrigued by the portrayal of Behemoth in the book? And what's the relationship to cats in general?
Well, what's funny to me is that cats have always been like they're naughty, sure. Like they're up to no good. So I think in that way it fits. But cats are also highly individual. So where is everyone in the book? Is the book done?
Yeah.
Are we done with the book? Okay. So the fact that he's not actually a cat in the end, I feel like makes sense. That checks out to me. But it's I don't know, I kind of like it. Like it almost makes it more compelling as a cat lover, because that's the part of cats that I like, even though we want to say like, oh well, cats are great. Like we love it when humans are 100% good, but like we all have our mischievous sides, and I think it kind of allows us to embrace that a little bit. But then without being too deeply philosophical about it, I just love cat. So no matter what the cat character is, I'm going to love the cat character. And so I was just deeply entertained. And yeah, that's that's it. I would like a black cat now. But the 2 legs thing was a little off-putting, I think.
I'm kind of excited to sort of get little like figurine gifts to my cat lover friends of Behemoth and give them out. Okay, so we're going to open it up to everyone now to ask questions. There we go. So Alice, you are the first in line, so go ahead.
Yeah, what's new? Through Awesome Liberty Fund, we've read so much 20th century Russian literature. I mean, so much. I think we've done 4 books, and I have just really enjoyed it. This one I had read years ago, Master and Margarita, and I struggled with. So revisiting it was really good. I'm too much of a realist, I think, that I just, yeah, didn't really hit me at the time. But I know myself and Victoria right now, and probably maybe others on here, are doing Anna Karenina. So my last month was was reading both of these, preparing for next month. We have 4 book club meetings. Anybody's welcome to join. So I've been thinking a lot about my question that I want to ask you, and then I changed it and just thought of this morning. So Juliette, Margarita and Anna, right? Both beautiful, passionate women with wildly different outcomes, right? Obviously Tolstoy very influential on all of what became the 20th century writers of the massive epic story. But I am interested in asking you about both the character of Anna and Margarita in the highly patriarchal society, which hasn't come up yet as one of the institutions of Russian all of history. And do you think that Bulgakov's character is a reaction to the passive, brilliant Anna and her terrible outcome, and is part of what is the satire and fantasy writing that he does, is making a female character in this oppressive society powerful and redemptive, and then, you know, ultimately happy at the end. And I don't think I ever would have thought before to wonder about even comparing these two characters, but what do you do with the two of them? How's that for a question?
That's a big question and a complicated one, and one that no one could ever imagine. Like, I was anticipating this and not this. I think there was something about their vibes. I'm just going to talk in vibes for a minute. I did not love either of them. I think you want to love Anna a lot more than you can. But with Margarita, you love her, and yet there's something where you're like, I don't know. That might just be me. But I think that they both stand similarly as kind of an opposition to what women are beheld as. I'm just going to say that in their times. So you did a very good job in framing it so that they're both like in them against society in a sort of way. And how do they fit? They're both kind of protagonists in a way. You might not call Margarita the main protagonist. I don't think you would say that about Anna either, because there's Levin. But Anna is not a good actor in a world where we think women are always the good actors. And Margarita has been handed the world on a silver platter in a time where no one has the world on a silver platter, being a woman with a husband who provides, and she's not happy. And so, kind of in this way, they stand as a critique to how I think women are seen, but also like, what does it mean to live a good life? It doesn't mean to have it all, because they both kind of have it all on paper, but they don't. And I think they're the only characters that actually round out this idea, because they stand as a criticism, whereas the men in the stories, almost like I think about the master, he's kind of struggling against his like inner demons, but and the outer demons, right? But she doesn't have to struggle, and yet she does, because how to put this, I guess, it's not just what society does to you or gives you. It's not just the external, it's the internal as well. And I think both these women in their respective works kind of show that without the internal being in the right place, or without struggle towards the good, even when everything outside and exterior is good or neutral or better, right? It's more of a wealth as we consider it in economics, not an internal soulful wealth, which I think, and most of the economists I like also like to think about, but it's, I don't know, they fulfill the entirety of the book and of the message, without which you can't understand what it means to actually live a good life.
Yep, awesome.
There we go.
Yeah.
If I can edit,
answered your question.
If I could editorialize, I think great question and brilliant answer. So, Ryan.
One of the things that struck me most in this book are the things they didn't say, and things that they just glanced over and then left alone. Things like the way they just casually refer to people being disappeared or jailed or sent to the gulag, are the ways that cramped living conditions pervade the story and even drive the plot to someone, but no one really comments on it that much. Another characteristic of the Soviet system was something called blat, which is similarly tacit and informal and often unspoken. Some of the state goods that were provided didn't meet all people's needs, so you had all kinds of black markets and needed kinds of informal relationships and connections. If you had good blat, you had those good connections. Is that something that you've also seen in other Russian literature or in Russian culture in general, that kind of reading things in between the lines, things being very tacit?
Well, so that's the thing. Even in the time of serfdom, right? That was like one of the big issues in Russia of the 19th century. So before this, you have none of that. I mean, there's some, like within the community, but you can think of like a rural-ish society or even within Moscow, and it's more of a societal connection. Like, what parties do you get invited to? Maybe the issues that we would face being in America today, right? What does it mean to live a social life and to have social standing? I would say the problems of Russia, in terms of these like networks and how do you get what you want, it resembles more Edith Wharton and kind of like New York high society. So what this actually looks a lot like is 1984, which was based off of We by Evgeny Zamyatin, who also wrote around this time with like kind of a different take. Like he's very blocky, and I don't even know how to explain it properly. 10 out of 10 recommend, but it's very much a characteristic of these sorts of regimes. Anytime where totalitarian, like dictatorships, dystopian sort of societies are characterized, you have this, and you don't really otherwise. So it is a very specifically this moment sort of a feature. It's not a Russian thing. So good to catch on to that. The context in the back of the book was super helpful because otherwise you wouldn't have caught it. At least I wouldn't have caught it. I say you as in the big royal you, not you specifically. But it's hard to catch, but it's significant. Like the fact that you go to apartment number 50 just to see if your wife's nephews, whatever. That's not normal. And that wasn't the case way back when. There were more, if that sort of situation arose, it would be clear from the beginning, oh, you're related to this person in this way. This is handed down. A lot of the work that Tolstoy wrote this play that actually touches on that idea of who gets the inheritance. It's a lot more like Jane Austen, like it's written in the law that the son gets. And so if it's not the son and you don't have a son, and he didn't care so much about making sure women had the inheritance, but that was how it was characterized more than how do I like wither or meander my way into this relationship to get what I need to eat or live or whatever. It's very Soviet.
That one of the things that struck me the most was that one of the only characters to have a happy ending or something close to it is the maitre d' at the writer's restaurant who lets in Behemoth and some of the others, knows exactly what's about to happen, runs back into the kitchen, grabs a couple of giant fish, runs off, and is never heard from again. Everyone else is victims of the big fire that follows after that. I find significance in.
Yeah, well, because he has a piece of information that no one else has. Because the truth is, information economics and the passage of information, and information is leverage, living a life where you have a slight comparative advantage is true of human nature. If you know which berries kill you and which ones don't, you're the one who survives. So,
there's a little bit of Kurtzner and Hayek in that as well, if you're creative about it.
Oh, definitely.
Did we end?
Kevin, I think, is next.
I got cut. Sorry about that. I wanted to comment just very quickly on Ryan. I didn't hear what he said at the end because my internet connection went bad, but just for everyone, if there's if you want to look at the issue about the apartments and stuff, there's a great book called The House of Government, which explains how the Soviet bureaucracy allocated the apartments and what happened when people were persecuted and sent away, and then the battle to get into the better apartment. And then with regard to Blatt, as Ryan Rose, there's there was great, what they called the thaw generation, which is after Khrushchev, Stalin dies, and Khrushchev comes in. One of the things that he did was he invited a lot of finally Western academics to come in and study how the system operated. And there's a bunch of books that are written around that time, but it's only like a 6-year window, because then after Khrushchev is overturned, then they shut the system down to access again. But one of those books is by a guy named David Granick, who taught at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And in that book, he has this great phrase, which he quotes a Russian phrase at the time, which is Blatt is higher than Stalin. So Blatt is higher than Stalin, which is the issue that basically the whole thing of rents. And if you want to read a decent book examining the whole rent-seeking aspect of this society, there's a book by 2 Hungarians called Dictatorship Over Our Needs, which is very good. And then the final book, which whenever we talk about this and the kind of need to have, as Juliette called it, protected language, is a book by Orlando Figes called Whispers. And we talked about this before when we did our Kessler book and everything like that. But these societies, what Figes explains is that you had layers of whispers, because you whispered to your friends so that no one could oversee you, but among your friends, they would be whispering to the officials so that they could get better favors. And so you had to take that into account in the way that you whisper about things. So again, as Ryan pointed out, when you're writing this and you're engaged in this protective language, you're going to say a lot of things that you want to, you're not going to say things that you want to say, but you have to say them somehow. And that's like the codes and what Juliette refers to as the context, that, and it's hard to have that unless you understand it at some level. So, okay, Kevin.
All right. I'm not a fan of magical realism. I generally don't like it, but I enjoyed this book a surprising amount. And I think the author helped me a lot. Like, I don't have the book right now. Like on page 103 or thereabouts, he says that the one character suddenly had to, on the spot, invent ordinary explanation for extraordinary events, which is exactly the opposite of what the book is. The book, he's just saying, this is what I did. I'm going to write extraordinary explanation for the everyday ordinary events that Russians were experiencing. And I thought that one, just that paragraph, turned the whole thing around for me. And I said, oh, this is what he's doing. He can't do it the regular way. And, my antidote book, my balancing book, was Gentleman in Moscow, in which the authors, mention, and they talk about in one chapter, Russians perfected internal exile, which was more effective than external exile, because if you exiled them externally, they made a new life. If you exiled them internally, they were still embedded in the Russian culture, and so that really worked as this balancing thing for me. I'm surprised at how much I enjoyed this book and how well it was done. And so thanks a lot, Peter. It was a great experience for me. But your early discussions about Russian, I've read some Russian literature and stuff, and I prefer Turgenev because he feels like he actually loves the country and the people and the geography and all of it. And I'm never sure about the rest of them, but it's still so foreign to me. And it's like that religious term, historiography. It's a biography and history, who we are and where we came from. And I'm always, in Russian literature, I'm always reminded, I mean, it feels more foreign than most, other than like maybe Japan. This is an entirely different historiography, and that makes it harder for me, but interesting, a different perspective. Anyway, thanks for the book. I really enjoyed it.
There's this short story by Turgenev where he really gets at what the Russian soul is. It's short, it's like 15 pages. I'll find it, I'll send it to Amy, then she can send it out. But I think it was super helpful for me. I had a professor walk me through it on like the first day of one of my classes, and understanding what the method of Russian culture is, but also what it means to actually identify. And because it's written by him, I think you're right. He loves Russia. He loves what it means to be a Russian. And it feels kind of like reading the Declaration of Independence, where you understand, even if you don't do it analytically, it's just there's something about the way that the words resonate. That's how that short story felt. So I think that might be helpful. So I'll send that along.
Anyone else want to jump in here? Yep, go ahead, Taylor.
Juliette, thanks for taking the time to do this.
Thanks for having me.
I listened to a lot of your podcasts. Do you know what Bulgakov's religious background and beliefs were? Because I don't know. I don't know if the quotation was in this book or not, but there's a quotation about the devil's greatest trick was convincing people he didn't exist. And atheism was, of course, kind of the official position of the Russian government at the time. If he was a Christian, is this some way of, if the devil exists, then obviously implies God exists as well. And if Stalin is the devil, then it kind of highlights the fact that there is evil in this world, especially in a world where you pretend that religion and the religious figures, Christ and so forth, don't exist. And so the devil's kind of having his playful way of saying, I'm here, and I can be naughty or I can be evil. I just wondered if we know anything about what Bulgakov's religious beliefs were, and if that's part of the point he was trying to make.
Well, it's just, Juliette, do you have an answer to that? I was gonna just riff on the first part of the book. Yeah.
All I guess I really know is that this book to me is an indication that he is not an atheist. Not only is it a clever method of calling out the Soviet system, but it is kind of, if one exists, it's like prohibition. Like it's like an absolute stance, which obviously means that the other extreme has to exist in some form. So I would say I don't know exactly how religious he is or if he is, but based on this, I would say 100%, at least a little bit, believes in God.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Taylor, one of the interesting things is actually right in the beginning of the book, because the professor is having this heated debate with the other person over basically atheism, and then Woland appears and basically says, you're all full of it because I've been here from the beginning. And, of course, God exists and everything like that. And so it's like right in your face, right in the beginning, which is to call into question, and then predicts the guy's death. And then, like all the things that go on afterwards, right? Which is, it's the precursor of all the stuff has to do going back to the apartments later on and everything. It's just right from the beginning of the book, which is amazing. As Juliette pointed out, though, this is written in 1939. That's when he's done writing it. And it doesn't get fully published until like even the 60s, 70s, when it fully comes out. So its cultural influence, I think, its biggest cultural influence, like 68 when it came out. It was like this absurdist literature, and people got all excited about it. And that's why I asked the question about Mick Jagger, because that's what he got all excited about. He wrote Sympathy for the Devil, and blah blah blah. Which, of course, by the way, if you know anything about Rolling Stones history, is also a very cultural moment, because it was while they were playing that song that the murder happened, right, at their concert in California, right, when the Hells Angels stabbed the guy or whatever, and it was right in the middle of the song when they were playing that. So anyway, but then you go ahead, and then Ryan, and that might bring us to the end. But go ahead.
Pete, can I say one quick thing?
Oh yeah.
At the end, despite that conversation at the beginning, the explanations ultimately, as a result of the investigation, are that it was all hypnosis and ventriloquism and magic. It wasn't religion. It wasn't evil. It was just, mass hypnosis. So it's like rejecting that idea at the very end by the Russians.
Yeah.
And that turned out for them not so well.
Yeah.
Can I go now? Or
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Just a small point I want to bring up real quick. I heard that, well, Peter said Wohlen, but I heard that he's German, so I say Voland. I don't know. And that kind of got me thinking, is he supposed to be a stand-in for Marx? He's German also. A German guy entering Russian society with his ideology, I guess. But to my main point, so I was just reflecting back on the themes during the golden era of Russian literature, Dostoevsky and all that. And there was this like theme of resisting influences from the West. They wanted to keep the old Russia, right? And that was sort of the major theme, I guess. You had the respect for religion, Christianity, and stuff like that, and Crime and Punishment. So you see like the transition from that kind of Russian society into the atheistic one where Bulgakov is writing. So I just thought of that, like the transition in the mentality of Russia. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it still does play on the same point, right? Kind of to what we were talking about just a minute ago. Almost every single human nature question can be probably formulated in terms of man versus God. And so a lot of the time, older Russian literature is God-fearing, whereas this is, well, devil-fearing, and it's not thinking about God, but in God's absence, God is present, right? So I think you're right. Like, it is a weird juxtaposition, but it's also kind of a continuation. I also think it is, at least I was listening a bit to the audiobook, and it was pronounced Voland, like Volkswagen, instead of Volkswagen. But anything goes. I think
I heard at some point the characters were saying like he's speaking German. So that just got me thinking, I don't know.
Yeah. You can get as Straussian as you want about it. I think it could be, given how subtle a lot of the references are and a lot of the points are, you're probably right. But I don't know if much is lost if you don't want to read that into it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but not much is coincidental in this work, I don't think. So,
The pronunciation is supposed to be exactly how you put it, which is the German pronunciation of the name. Yeah. Ryan.
Like Alice, I read this concurrently with Anna Karenina because I'll also be participating in that virtual reading group. Do you think it's a coincidence or not that both books begin with a fatal train accident?
Probably not. Probably not. I mean, in Anna Karenina, have you finished it? I don't want to spoil it, but also it's hard because it's like basically in the common culture. So I don't know. Am I allowed?
I haven't finished it.
But okay, they're both indicative of how the rest of the work will go. I'll say that much. You can say that pretty easily. If you watched Gilmore Girls, you had the plot of Anna Karenina spoiled because in like the third episode they say it. So when I was 7, I knew what happened. That's just my thing. I think what's funny is how they differ in what actually does end up happening. They're different types of train wrecks, but they're train wrecks. So I don't think it's an accident. I do think a lot of Russian literature is self-referential. So different artists talking about the same themes or things that they have in common will reference, like there's this whole part where he's making fun of Pushkin, and like, what would Pushkin change the light bulb? No, of course not. But it's that sort of thing, I think, where it is a device for multiple reasons. It kind of sets you up if you read the work without knowing about Anna Karenina, but also if you know anything about how Anna Karenina goes. It's more of a buy-in because you're like, oh, this is the Russian literature I'm familiar with. This is the culture turned on its head, really.
Yeah,
it's a good question.
From Tolstoy's Train Accident, I took it as a commentary on technology and progress and change, and not necessarily a positive one. With Bulgakov, I took it more as just chaos. There's no rhyme or reason behind it. Same advice, but at least in my interpretation, very different intentions. So I could be wrong.
I think you're right. Tolstoy did not like technology. He was big on like being one with the land and being with the earth, and work provides connection to God and the answers to the big human questions. He really didn't like technology, which is kind of ironic because his whole life was basically possible with like an entire estate because of this, right? So he benefits from a lot of the stuff that he talks about as being bad. A lot of people don't like to keep that in mind. I feel the need to mention it every time we talk about this, but I think it's like two ways of saying the same thing. Tolstoy has a blame for what is causing it, whereas I think the very thing that Bulgakov blames is chaos. Chaos that could have been avoided pretty easily. Maybe not pretty easily. I think it's probably pretty easy, but I think you're right. They are similar and yet very different, and the ways that they're different indicates kind of where the author is going and about what the author actually thinks about the world they operate in.
This is to Ryan and Juliette. I have a question that your point just brought up on this, which is, Tolstoy is an anarchist, okay, and so is Tolkien. Tolkien, and they both see, the technology as a danger, right? This is why in Tolkien, what you get is the hobbits, right, in Middle Earth are leading like the wonderful life, right? They're the ones that are, just what you said, and they're back to the earth and all these things like that. And Tolkien is a reaction to what? It's his experience in World War I. Right, and the horrors of what he saw, and what made World War I horrible is advanced technologies, right? That they, now, and so I'm wondering, how much of that theme, this war, and just permeates these thinkers when they live through it, right? So,
yeah,
like how
I'm looking,
about a world. This is actually a very Chris Coyne type point, right? Like, how do we live in a world where, we're not going to demonize our enemies or whatever, right? I mean, just think about like contemporary affairs and the way people, frame their reaction to the different things. So it's just, yeah, it's a very, how do we do that? So anyway. Any other last question? This is going once, going twice, going 3 times. Okay. Juliette, thank you so much for everything. I thought that your insights were really powerful. So, great economist, and now it turns out great literary critic. So